Such a big stuff.
Yeah. But today,
Did I get an email to you? I think
I hope so.
Are you writing yourself?
Yes, I am.
Did you hear from everyone?
Let me give you one of these.
I'm not quite sure what the logic was behind.
So I work with a team of musicians, an artist, and a moderator. So every month I put out a new the story and then the original artwork and music as well.
Yeah, because
so I'm doing that while I'm also writing a novel. So this is all set. They're all set in the same world. So the idea is that you can kind of develop and flesh out the world through short form fiction, publish online, and then the idea is when I finish writing the novel, hopefully the audience to be able to like start to. That's the theory.
That's very interesting to do the novel world with like planning, because I mean it's always really interesting, you know, when you try to do something like that. Sure.
Yes. Yeah. So I've got four seasons scoped out. Each one got 60 episodes, and I've got 3 novels scoped out very loosely. So I've kind of like planned out very loosely about the room as a novel. But basically what I've decided to do is I want to make it a much more interactive experience with any audience that I kind of fill around a bit.
Yeah.
So I've planned out the episodes and like what needs to happen in each episode. But there's a lot of room to respond to how the audience receives it. So they say like, oh, I like this bit, I'm interested in this. I can work that in, as long as it doesn't take me away from the core storyline, if that makes sense. And then
look at my phone, it's fine.
Put out a little bit of bonus.
Yeah, same.
Like either a bit of their religious
I'm a pen and
text
paper
or
person.
folk
I
song
am, but
or whatever it is. And I want to try and keep it.
So is this
I'm always a bit nervous about relying on TV as well.
Actually, I brought these from gift, so one to
Thank you.
It's
Is it something?
smart grass. It's forward by Ramsey Campbell.
There's enough structure to make sure
Yeah,
it's
sure.
satisfying story and has a consistent tone, but enough flexibility
With just an E.
that
Rachel will just need.
can have a meaningful impact on the story as it's being written. Because that's one of the
You're going to scribble them.
That's dangerous. You should spell it out because you'll get someone spelling it R-E-C-H-L.
So that's the theory. We'll see if we're going to do it.
That's unfair. Are you saying he's the Starbucks coffee of all the rappers? So what's your name? Rachel. Okay, so X.
And like
But you know, you do.
the feedback I find to be really
It's not that uncommon for
So I
Rachel
think
to
the
be
beta
spelled
readers
R-E.
get that kind of feedback.
Right.
It's very good.
I spelled it wrong.
No. I'm just saying. I'm just saying it's ambiguous.
Seeing which parts of the law that they enjoy, and so that's kind of influencing ideas that they've got for context. Yeah. Yeah.
I used to be very stressful. I used to have to open her own door at 7 a.m. But every shop until it was like, we don't open until 9.
How about yourself? What do you do as a writer?
Yes, I'm a writer. I started around 6 years. But you can find me like on social media. So because I'm very more discovering. I'm trying to learn. Okay, I was in next. Where did you travel?
Yeah.
But I started it was a very interesting experience, and I just decided like, okay, this story is good. I need to sit down and plot it because just with the enough that amount it wasn't enough.
Yeah. I think it's a hard balance to strike, isn't it? Like I tried to talk about our Martin describe
Just everything is diabetic, so that's why I'm.
And then Gardner kind of
Usually it works on my phone like that, but it's not working, so that's the old-fashioned way. So tell us about your other two.
Within that structure. It's quite a
Somebody else
hard balance.
visiting, is it?
Yeah, that's when we have one more panelist. She's got 3 minutes to go.
Yeah.
3 minutes to go.
I mean, maybe we could write it serialized and then finish it and then release it.
We will start with that.
Okay. I'm okay using my phone for my notes, is that alright?
Yeah.
I don't look rude, that's all.
You will hear what you say, but it's not.
I'm going to be doing the same.
Yeah.
Some people
Cornwall.
used to. I don't know.
Do you know Cornwall?
Like
Yeah, I was
Alex.
there once, I think. Yeah. For a few days.
How do you enjoy the
I've never even been able to like write notes while
I mean, it has.
listening to things. That just never left.
Well, I do. Yeah, so,
What-
it's nice.
Yeah, what's that word? not what's that.
Is this even right?
I don't use it for writing and taking notes because I'm in my professional life. I'm a journalist as well, so I used to use shorthand, but what I use now is you can put voice to text now, it's quite accurate. So when I interview someone, I interview them and it just
Wow, so you moved on.
it's quite handy for that. I mean, it goes for writing, but it translates really quite handy for their taking.
But still, that's a hard time to move somewhere new.
Yes,
So that's,
I was doing an MA here, and also some was online.
You're on time.
No, you're almost exactly on time. Just that we're all early.
it's just stuck in It's strange how much that affects you mentally, like not having that interaction. I consider myself more on the introvert side. But even to me, it was very weird.
Of course.
So just a little gift to everyone.
A little bit, just at least say hello to the person.
You're not allowed to use your own collection.
As what, sorry?
You're not allowed to use your own
Can you hear me at the back?
You're allowed to plug
Wave
it,
if
just
you
not-
can't hear me.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that everybody can hear us. Can you all test your mics?
Hello.
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 Yeah, so welcome to Shortcraft is the title of this panel. I'm going to be talking about short stories for the next hour or so. My name is Peter Sutton. I'm the editor of BFS Horizons, so the British Fantasy Society fiction magazine. I've also edited other magazines in the past. Both my short story collections were shortlisted for the British Fantasy Award. I had a short story shortlisted for the British Fantasy Award. I had an anthology that I've edited, been shortlisted for the British Fantasy Award, and I have several stories in best of collections. I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves and also to say what their favourite short story collection is and why. Mine, of the last few years, is a short story collection by a Swedish author called Karen Tidbeck, and the short story collection is called Jagnath. And the reason I like it is it's just so full of imagination. Each story is a world unto itself. We'll just go left to right to start with. So Tina.
I'm Tina Rath. I have a couple of collections of short stories published. One by an editor who said at my age it would be nice to have something to leave behind as a memory.
Wow.
With every, yes, I like short stories. I mainly write short stories, partly because, strangely enough, no one ever accepted my 4-volume trilogy. And I'm serious. My favourite short story collection, I started making a list, and when it reached the end of a sort of page, I love the stories of John Collier, Window to Watch for Elder People, and Guy de Maupassant, Saki, E.F. Benson, M.I.J. sorry, practically everything in short story form, partly because their effects are economical. You read it and sometimes you get the hit. And strangely enough, although it's a surprise, it works again and again. You still have that, well I do, that jerk of recognition. Oh, that's it. Oh God, that's it. Oh no, yes. You know what I mean.
Thank you.
I'm Devin Martin. I'm one of the audio producers for Podcastle, and before that, for 5 years, I read Slush for Podcastle. So that's my main expertise in short stories. My writing of short stories has been on hold for health reasons. I'm hoping one day to find the brain energy to get back to it, but embarrassingly, I have never read a collection of short stories. All my short story reading, as a lover of short stories, all my short story reading has been individual short stories in magazines or in slush.
Nothing wrong with magazine.
Yeah, but I would still like to recommend a collection of one of my favorite short story writers who, despite some award nominations, I think she's underappreciated, and that's Carolyn M. Yokin. She has a collection called Seven Wonders of a Once and Future World. Came out in 2016, and I think it's well worth checking out.
Cool.
Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Rachel Grosvenor. I'm an author, an editor and a writing coach. I've lectured in kind of giving short story advice. My favourite short story collection, sounds a bit, there we go, echoey, is Laurie Moore.
Hot.
Hot.
As in?
Yeah. Laurie Moore and her short story collection. Thank you. Her short story collection, Self-Help. That's because she has the ability to make me cry within like half a page, and that's amazing. Kate Atkinson is my favourite novelist, and she has just released a short story collection, which I'm currently reading, and so far I'm also really enjoying that. I've had short stories published in various anthologies and reviews as well.
Hello everybody, my name is Richard Clive. I am the author of my debut collection, Strange Frequencies, which is published by Sinister Smile Press and features a foreword by Ramsey Campbell. I've had work published in numerous anthologies too, many of them American and Canadian, across several publishers. I've been writing for about 10 years, but it was only in the last 3 years that I started sending apart from one novel a long time ago, that I started sending my stuff out, and so yeah, that's me. My favourite short story collection is probably Books of Blood by Clive Barker, if I had to name one. I know it's not terribly original, but that would probably the second volume. I can't tell you why, there's something magical about the book. Others that I like, I enjoy, again, not terribly original, but I really enjoyed some of Joe Hill's short stories too. Ramsey Campbell, Alone with the Horrors, I read a while ago. I really enjoyed that one. So those are the ones that I like, but my tastes are quite diverse. I know I've named some quite popular people there, not terribly original, but those are the ones I like. So that's me.
Okay, before we really get into it, can we have a show of hands as to who writes short stories in the room who hasn't been published? Who wants to be published? Okay, so if you're starting from scratch and know nothing about short stories, where do you start?
I would say you start with a plot. So when I'm teaching the art of writing a short story, it depends on the person who's listening's experience. But at school we were all taught that a story needs to have a beginning, a middle and an end. And we're using kind of short stories. If you're really beginning, at the very beginning, something very useful is Freytag's pyramid, because you can understand, okay, well, at the beginning, I need to have my exposition, and then I'm using the middle for my rising action into my climax, and then the end is going to be my falling action. So that, I think, is the most useful place to start if you're really starting out writing short stories.
Alternative views? Who starts with the character?
I start with a sentence sometimes that will make the title of the story, and then build it from there.
I think conflict's a good. Conflict is, I always try and drive the narrative with conflict, which I don't know if that's a cliche to say that, and it's quite basic, but you put characters in a situation, or a character or characters in a short story. Usually, often it is a small number of characters. Though I have written ones with more, and usually they've got some sort of conflict going on. So you think of a conflict of something, and why would somebody be conflicted, either internally or externally, or both, and then work from there, and then try and feel what that person feels, and that's how I sometimes start it. And then it's word by word, and it's very much a slog, sometimes in terms of what happens next. But that's how I tend to start with conflict.
So, 5 different people, 5 different ways of writing a short story, probably, and the same in reading. So, Toby Litt's got an introductory course on his website. He teaches print writing. Used to be at Bedford College, now at UEA. And he says a short story needs something, someone, some time, and some place. Is he right? Can we do without one of those things?
Could you repeat what you said? I bet everyone else is thinking the same.
Yeah, something,
yeah,
someone, some place, and some time.
I mean, I think to some extent there are no rules, but if you're starting out, you should pay attention to rules. If that makes sense.
You need to know what the rules are before you break them.
Exactly.
For sure. Yeah.
Exactly.
Adam Neville's got a collection, hasn't he? Where there's no characters. I can't remember the name of it. I've read it.
Weirder than the derelictions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so, and that was a good read. That's broken those rules that we just mentioned. But yeah, generally speaking, if you're, having a crack the first time, maybe don't start like that.
Exactly.
Unless you're Adam Neville. Yeah.
Anybody else?
I mean, that's definitely what I would include. That's how I would begin. Absolutely. I would also try and think about how long I want it to be, because in terms of writing a short story, limiting yourself can be quite helpful, I find.
We'll move on to limitations, actually. Well, let's talk about it now. So, one of the things we discussed prior to the panel was whether or not we wanted to define what a short story was and whether or not that was helpful. And essentially, I would say we discussed, but I decided that we would say that it's everything below novella length, which seems fair. Which immediately gives us a constraint of word count. So how does word count help you write a short story?
It keeps you in within the boundaries of it. So, for instance, at the moment I'm writing something which is somewhere between a long and short story and a novella. I think it's about 12,000 words. It's a fantasy. It's a dark fantasy story as well. So it's fantastical world building and all that, which is in a short story. Generally, you have to do that, but you have to do that in a very quick and concise way and keep the story moving, I think. But when you're just writing, say, a 5,000 word short story, those boundaries should keep you focused. And keep you, anything that doesn't need to be there doesn't need to be there. Where in a novel or even a novella, maybe you might include those details because you think there's a wider benefit later on. In a short story, you might hint at a world outside of your short story, so you could have a short story, I don't know, about something day to day, but there could be something much grander going on in the background that you might hint at, but you don't necessarily. I would try and, with that, not just give a load of exposition and explain what that thing was. So it keeps you focused, unlike me rambling on. It keeps you focused.
I would agree with that. I just had a short story published that was 500 words, had to be 500 words exactly. And the challenge there was to review every use of every single word. I had to be very spare, and I had to really consider, okay, this isn't going to work. I need to say this in a different way. I need to force myself to think of this in a different way. And I did find that a challenge, but it was also a great challenge, because it forced me not to lean on my initial first draft sort of indulgences.
Yeah, most people's reading is vastly skewed towards novel. Like most of the words people read is in novels, most of the time. And so for most people, that's what people think fiction is and should be. And so when they try and write, that's how they write. And we see it in Slush all the time, people writing like it's a novel, and they just don't get to the point. So you need to learn the constraints of the word length.
Let the story tell itself.
Yeah. Right. Short story readers, and Slush readers in particular, are the most impatient people, the most impatient readers. Yeah, you.
I was going to come on to how to get your story published later, but this is entirely true. I do have some Slush readers for Horizons, I imagine, who read the entirety of the stories, I guess. I tend to read the first paragraph, sometimes the first sentence at the side of the story, and that's the kind of market that a lot of short story markets are like. That people have got a very limited amount of time, may get thousands of stories, and you've got to grab them immediately. So just on constraints still, and what to do, what not to do. So out of the things that Toby Litt was talking about, should you limit the number of characters, limit the time span of the story, limit the locations, the number of scenes, or could you have a story that starts at the beginning of the time and ends at the end of the time?
Yeah, I often do that. Sometimes I'll use a device where I write in the present tense and switch back to the past tense, and then switch back to the, not that's hugely original or anything, pretending I meant it, but you know, it's something that I frequently do where I'll start off with two characters, and I sometimes just keep it in past tense, but I'll have two characters maybe, or three characters, or four characters, whatever, something happening now, and then something that happened before, it goes back and switches between, and then you try and intertwine those two plot lines, and that works quite well. I think sometimes that can work well. I'm not saying it was for me, but yeah. So I don't think you are limited. I think at first, when you're first learning to do it, maybe you should stick to like a tried and tested methods. But once you have an idea what you're doing, then you can try new things.
All those constraints are very useful, I think. People do try to widen the scope in various ways, and it can work beautifully, but it's very difficult to pull off. And yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that.
I think dialogue's a good tool. If you try and write a short story and you've got more than one character, you think, right, I'll just write it as dialogue. Not as in, do you know this, that, that, I don't mean in that way.
As you know, Bob.
Yeah, as you know, Bob. But if you can think of it like a dynamic way where two people are having a conversation and tell that story through that conversation, forget anything else, and then fill in the blanks later, you can do that. I mean, I have done that to start off with. Quite often in a notepad, we'll jot a conversation down, and that'll be the basis for that story. It's a good way to start. And it keeps you writing lean doing that as well. Sorry, anyway.
No, that's all right. It's worth remembering that dialogue is action. And you need action in any story.
I think
So, Tina, where do you
one of the most startling and very good ways of starting a short story that I can remember is by Saki. And it's just a sentence spoken by one person to another. There is a wild beast in your woods. And it rather sets the scene because it's a nasty story, but it's very funny. And it is about a werewolf. But just that single sentence will, in my opinion, grab the reader by the throat and get them reading.
don't want a werewolf to grab you by the throat?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay, well that's a good point. Let's talk about hooks then. How do you start a short story in a way that hooks a reader in?
I mean, it's the challenge of writing the first line, isn't it? It's kind of the same with novels and everything. The first line has to make you go, huh, what's going on there? And want to know more, find kind of setting up some kind of a mystery or something like that. The first line of my novel was, there had been a murder. Because I wanted the reader to go, really? Who was killed? What happened? I think of a short story very much as like a snapshot of time, like you're arriving at a party after it started and you're leaving before it's ended. So I like to kind of pull a reader into the action. They're walking through the door and what's before them.
Just tell us why the story is interesting. And could be a character, could be a mystery, like you say. Just what made you interested in writing the story? Show the reader that as soon as possible.
I mean, going back to slush reading and what I was saying earlier about first sentences and first paragraphs, a lot of people write their way into a short story. There's quite a lot of stories that we get that you can tell there's a bit of throat clearing at the beginning that they haven't gone back and reread it with their eye as to how do I capture the reader. And it's a bit of waffle at the beginning. What's a good way of avoiding that, I guess, is the question.
There's a task that I like to set myself, and that is to rewrite my first paragraph using no words that I used in the original paragraph. So even and the, it's a real challenge, but it forces you to be spare, to think of what is actually not working in the writing, and basically to just create something entirely new. And it kind of gives you scope to read it as a reader as well. It's like when you send an email and you've read it 100 times and you don't see any errors in it, and then as soon as you've sent it, you see that there was an error in it and you don't understand how you couldn't see that before. Well, it's because you're suddenly reading it as the reader. So that's what I try and do. I read that paragraph as the reader and try and rewrite it as that person.
Or even still, does the story still work if you start a few paragraphs later?
I mean, there are quite a few that if you persevere, or the slush readers have said that it's actually a good story, but I don't see it in the first paragraph or so, I will read on, and generally it is the fact that you can just hit the first paragraph.
Yeah.
Which could be a methodology of creating good stories. Consider whether or not you need to start that with the way that you have started it. So you mentioned Freytag's pyramid. There is some pushback against that, or it has been recently, with the fact that it's quite a phallocentric structure, rising action, climax, falling action. Are there other short story structures that are useful? Do you consider structure as well when you construct a story?
No, I just go. It's purely on instinct. And I think if you've got an instinct for a story, I mean, obviously on the basic level, start, middle, end. But even that, I change up. But for me, it's purely instinctual and understanding. I'm not trying to be clever, or probably not very clever, because I just do it my own way. But it's all instinct, and yeah.
I do think structures like that are useful when you are setting out writing, when you're learning about writing. I do think, though, that we all have intrinsic understanding of what a story is like, how a story is told. We all understand that within ourselves.
Well, you say that, and some people clearly don't.
Well, I will say that as an editor and a coach, I've had so many people come to me with stories saying, I didn't plot this. People have a general understanding that you are kind of writing towards a climax at a certain point, That's the way that I've understood it.
So do you always have an ending in mind then?
Me? No.
No, not the way.
No.
So when I do, sometimes it turns out better. But I only write towards that. I still don't know what's going to happen. But I never know what the story is until I finished it.
No, I think I'm a discovery writer, so I sort of write myself into it. But I'm saying when you first start out and if you don't really know what's going on, it can really help to have that structure so that you can think about what you're doing.
I've discovered that I get bored if I know what's going on and I don't bother to finish it. It's very shallow.
Yeah, similar. I think I outline novels, but I don't outline short stories. Just sort of dive in, write it once to tell myself the story, and then look at it from the story point of view.
The good thing I do with that is if I get stuck because I don't know, just this might help other people, it might not. I quite often write a short story, don't know what's or a novella, and I get to a point where I don't know what there's some sort of truth that I'm trying to find or reveal, and I can't find what that is. And so I put it aside and I write something else, and I come back to it, and it's a really good. I had people talk about writer's block. I had writer's block for a while. I think when I was awaiting for my book to come out, I don't know why, but I got writer's block. And then immediately when the book was out, I just had all these stories everywhere anyway that I could pick up, and then I just move between things. And I find it's a really good way. Once you get things where you've got to a certain point you can't finish, you go back and then you can, and that's just something. I don't know why I'm bringing that up, but that's one method I use. You know, in terms of not knowing what's going to happen next.
I mean, short stories are good. I mean, even if you want to write a novel, short stories are good in that they can teach you about finishing. Because it's a lot easier to finish a short story than it is to write a novel.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so yeah, all these, there are lots of structures, and they're all useful tools of thinking about how stories work. But that's all they are. They're just modes of thinking about things, right? And even my dogged insistence of getting to the point, that's just one way of thinking. And maybe that's not the way your brain will work, or the way you'll want to write a story. And maybe somewhere out there, there are people who will want to read stories that'll take a long time to get to. Or maybe you're just not actually a short story writer. And that's fine. So.
Now, the other thing I was going to say about structure is that a lot of the stories we get sent, and you've probably seen this as well as a slush reader, is there's either too much story, so it's a frustrated novelist, I guess, or too little story. And so too little story seems to be more common than too much story. So how do you avoid writing an anecdote or a vignette or just a scene? How do you ensure that there's a story if you're not considering structure?
The characters are developed in some way, or it doesn't have to be that, but there's some sort of arc of progression that can be one way. There's maybe something that you reveal, so it's not just you reveal again a truth, some sort of truth or something you want to reveal, and you think, and that's worth revealing. I think that would be my answer.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? No?
It's very difficult because it's mostly, as far as I'm concerned, instinctive. I don't make patterns, or I just get an idea or a sentence, or like the last story I actually wrote. The first sentence was, "How long is it since we last tasted human flesh, brother?" And from that, the whole story developed.
That's an excellent line.
Yes, that's a very good first line.
Particularly if it's spoken by someone's pet cat.
Oh, wow.
And how long was it?
Not all that long, one gets the impression, and it's certainly remedied by the end of the story.
Sounds fun.
Yeah.
Well, that's the problem. Well, I obviously don't write for a living. My writing is mainly fun, and if it's not fun, I don't bother.
That's
the
way to be.
Well, not
Especially in short fiction, there is no money.
Well, no money in it. No, I mean, I started 60 years ago, and I have had numerous stories published, and if I had sixpence for all of them, I'd probably be able to buy a drink here, possibly not.
Probably not, considering the bar prices.
I'm don't want to be a downer with people, you know, writing short stories is interesting, it's good. And I love reading short stories, I don't want to put anyone off, I want another supply. But it's in a way it's difficult, and in a way it's rewarding, but probably getting a job in Sainsbury's.
Yeah, don't give up your day job if you're going to write short stories. If you're just going to write short stories. So, yeah, I think that neatly brings us to short story markets then. If you're writing short stories, how do you go about getting them published? Would you target magazines first or anthologies? How do you find markets in the first place?
There's a website, isn't there, I think? Is it the Horror Tree?
There's the Horror Tree. There used to be Raylan, but I think that's now closed down. And then there's Submission Grinder.
Submission Grinder. But I would say just.
Unfortunate name.
It's a good joke. Funny little joke. But I would just say read magazines. If you read a magazine and you enjoy the stories in it, there's a good chance that means your taste aligns with the editor's, and that means that the editor might enjoy your stories.
We were actually discussing this last night. There are so many magazines, and if you're writing a whole bunch of short stories, you can't read them all.
Sure.
So, yeah, I mean, you can target some, and then there's the ones that will get hundreds of thousands of submissions here in dream markets, but there are also a whole bunch out there that you just can't read them all. So, I mean, how do you handle that?
I mean, you can take your chances on random markets by trawling through the submission grinder and things like that. That's fine, but I think your chances will be better if you've read the magazine and you know that your tastes align with that. That's what I'm saying.
I think it's like anything else as well in terms of submitting. It's like once you get one thing published, you can then use. The more you get published, the easier it becomes. Well, jinx myself. But so far, I've found it once you've got publishers who know you, and then certain things you can say, well, I've been published by this publisher, or I've done this, and that then when you send a letter, your submission letter, they're more likely to take notice, I think. So it becomes easier with every one that happens. I think it doesn't mean you can't go on a bad run, but
definitely, if you find an editor that buys a story, that by definition they like what you've written, so they're well worth targeting for another story.
Yeah,
for sure.
I also find it's worth trying anything once, really. My first ever story was published by Catholic Fireside.
Was it about cats eating people?
No, it was about making a pact with the devil, I suppose that's something. And anyway.
That's quite Catholic.
Presumably it was against making a pact.
Yes.
A cautionary tale.
A cautionary tale. Well, not necessarily. The man making the pact wasn't religious. The only defence he could remember against the whole thing was watching courtroom movies. So he said, "I will not sign, so help me God." But yes, anything. Try anything. Sorry, in my opinion, try anything. You never know. A spattergun approach.
It is a numbers game.
Yeah.
To start off with, for sure.
But don't say the same thing to two people at once.
Depends.
Yeah.
Some markets will allow
Please
that.
read the guidelines.
Yes.
I was about to say do's and don'ts of submitting. The very first one is read the guidelines
and follow
them.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's much easier now. You just press a button. When I was young, typed it with a carbon, kept the carbon copies, sent it off with a stamped addressed envelope so they could send it back.
So, are there any other do's and don'ts for submitting, apart from the guidelines, which is the one that
see people not getting rejection letters and then posting that on social media and then having to go at the editor and things like that. Often don't do that, you know. I see that all the time on believe it or not on social media, and it's like, well, don't get involved in any of that stuff.
For short
People
stories,
do, believe it or not.
For short stories, you probably don't need a cover letter that says anything other than, here's my short story called this, it's this long. Thank you. That's it.
I would say a big one is to keep your chin up, because you will get a lot of rejections in your writing career. It's really normal. And there's a lovely Sylvia Plath quote that I have by my desk, which is, "I love my rejection slips because they show me I try." And that is key. You will get rejections, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that the story's not worthwhile. So keep trying. That's a huge do. Do keep trying.
Oh yes, it's amazing how often you can send something out and someone says, "Oh, that's brilliant, I want to print it." I don't want to pay you anything.
Should you, that's a good question actually, should you only target paid markets?
You can try.
It's up to you. I mean, it depends what you want to do with your work. Like, I've definitely had my work published and I've got nothing out of it. I've also been paid for it. Sometimes I get a copy and that's great. Sometimes I'll pay for a copy and that's okay too. You know, it's really what you want. If you want to get your work out there, sometimes you do it for free. I'm not saying
so
it's
just
all
for those
established.
people who haven't been published, what should they expect with regards to payment? What's a good payment for a short story?
Varies in my experience.
I mean, the SIFWA professional rate is what, 7 cents a word? 10 cents? 8. Yeah.
It's gone up. Inflation.
Good is 10 cents a word. I mean, that's like we established. It's basically nothing anyway. So don't stress about not getting paid. If the market is making money, then don't give your work away for free. But if the market is not making money, then fine. Accept no paid. That's fine.
The other possibility is that the magazine or whatever that printed it for free, someone else sees it and wants to do a reprint, for which they will pay you a small sum. It happens. It's
And you can certainly sell your stories more than once.
yeah. Oh yes.
So that brings me on to contracts. So what to look for in a short story contract? That the rights revert to you is the key bit I look for.
The only time I've given everyone free was with contracts when I needed to get that story back, and they had the time hadn't elapsed with where they had the rights, and so I said, don't pay me, but you can have the story as long as I can have it back. But the contracts, again, when you're starting out, as long as the contract's not ripping you off totally, you know, just read it. I'm not a solicitor, but you know, just make sure it's fair. You know.
I mean, there is a specific panel about contracts tomorrow, I think. So if you're interested in that, go on.
And again, you can check out support for example contracts and things. That's sfwa.org if you're not familiar with that. Sorry.
Yeah, and the Society of Authors will look at contracts as well. More for novels, I guess. But you can always go to these sort of industry things, or if you're friends with authors, talk to them about their contracts. I did get a couple of questions recently myself for an article that somebody's asked me, and it says, what do you look for in a short story? And what kind of things make one short story stand out over another? And there are two questions I think that are worth considering, because if you're going to submit to like an anthology call out, some of them do get literally thousands of submissions for what could be 12 places. So the Flame Tree Press ones, for example, that Mark Morris does, they do get a good several thousand people submit. So how do you stand out? And you're a slush reader or an editor, what do you look for?
I mean, it's a bit ineffable, but maybe unattainable. But it's that, and you touched on, it's the story that actually makes me physically feel something. That jolt down the spine, that flash of recognition. I cry at the ending. I laugh because it's so funny. Anything, make me feel something, please.
Sometimes
I am
it's-
dead inside, and I want to feel something.
Sometimes that's real.
Yeah.
That's an but not that it's a real happening, God forbid, slander, but it says something and you think, yes, that's it. That's exactly how it would be.
Cohesion, I think, is a key word. The story is cohesion in the story. So, when the ending of the story comes, you feel satisfaction because it was always not that you guessed the ending, but it was almost like that was supposed to happen.
Inevitability.
And
So
that's threaded to the story.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned in the email chain before we met was Edgar Allan Poe's Unity of Effect, which is in essence is that what you should be looking for is to give the reader an emotion, and everything in the story should be aimed towards that. And Edgar Allan Poe wrote a few short stories, so you might know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
I think I'm looking for human connection. That's exactly it, human connection. There's a great Laurie Moore story where basically what happens is somebody puts like a cake in their face and says, I've always wanted to do that. Why did that make me feel like I was going to cry? Because the way she wrote it was more than the action. It was like a life's ambition being ticked off, and now everything was going to be different. It really reached inside you and touched you, even though in reality that would just be standing in front of someone who just did that with a cake. That's what I'm looking for, that sort of connection with the character.
So you build up to that, don't you? So if the cake was going to happen at the end, that's the moment. That's the I can't use that. I was going to use a phrase, and I thought I don't use that phrase. But the cake is the thing you build up to that cake. So by the time the cake's pushed in the face, the reader feels happy about it, or not happy, or satisfied.
Yeah.
That cake is in someone's face. You probably don't need the phrase I was going to use.
So one question I was going to ask is that are there any writing books, writing guides that you would recommend to people if they are starting out on the path to writing short stories? So one that came to mind when you were talking about Freytag's pyramid is Meander, Spiral, Explode. I can't remember the author's name, unfortunately, but it's alternative short story types to the actual rising action, falling action classic.
It's not necessarily about how to write, but Still Writing by Danny Shapiro is one of my favourite books on writing and on being a writer. And it's called Still Writing because every time she sees like a distant family member or an old friend or something, they're like, "Are you still writing?" And she's like, "Yeah." And I just, every time I read that, I feel seen as a writer. So I always recommend that because I think it's wonderful.
Anybody else?
I'm afraid I would say a dictionary and a small grammar book. Nothing which tells you can't use adverbs, or you must never use any alternative to the word said, but that you have to use strong verbs in any other situation. So you can't just walk, you have to leap, amble, navigate on. Don't touch them. I'm sure no one here would, but spelling, grammar, it is important. It really is.
I think those are more aimed towards novels, to be honest. So if you've got somebody, if you're doing a your characters only ever walk, and you've got that in every chapter. By the time you get to like the middle of the book, you're like, and also stronger verbs should be more visual verbs, so you can add a little bit of character that way. But as we said earlier, there are rules that you can break. Whether that's an actual rule or just more of a guideline, I don't know. Anybody else want to jump in on the books just before I?
There's a style guide. I can't remember. I've forgotten it. Style.
Strunk and White.
That's the one, yeah. And I just would recommend that. It's surprising, you know, how many writers. Sentence structure is really important, and it's, you know, you have to work hard to get that. That's just, if you follow the rules of that book, you can't go wrong. And it's a thin book. You can get it for the PDF on the internet. And any writer, whether they've been a writer for years or starting out, I recommend that book.
Yeah, so it's William Strunk and E.B. White. So E.B. White wrote Shorts for everything. And there's a set of guidelines on grammar in that, and then E.B. White writes an essay. Quite a lot of the editions you can find online don't have E.B. White's essay in them, so there are different versions. But Strunk and White is one that's recommended in Stephen King's own writing. So.
Oh, sorry, is that the Elements of Style? Is that what
Yes.
Is the little grey?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just checking.
My memory's dreadful.
I will also mention Damon Knight's book, which I found very helpful. And he talks a lot about the structure and theme, but also the markets. And it's still kind of relevant, even though it's written, I think, probably late 70s, early 80s. But a lot of books written at that period are not relevant anymore. Okay, so I'm going to throw it open to the audience to ask questions and have a bit of a rapid fire round. Yes.
You've all been talking about sort of the constraints of word length, and then Tina said, but if it's not fun. And how do you know, when you start writing a story, if you're not sure how it's going to finish or whatever, how long it's going to be? Because it seems that for newer writers in particular, if you say, right, you've got to stick to 4,000 words or whatever, there's that risk of writing to market rather than writing for the joy of it. And surely a lot of, when you start out, is just writing short stories to just work out how to write short stories. And if you're constantly sticking to different word lengths, does that not actually become an obstacle?
Yeah, so stories are the length they need to be, generally. And unfortunately, I think it's an experiential thing that once you've written a bunch, you kind of know. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is when do you know you've got too much story, or when do you know you've got not enough story? There's certainly a lot of the flash fiction that we get sent, so anything under 1,000 words, either has more story than is supported by the word count. It's just like it needs to be developed, or it is, as we were talking about earlier, just a vignette or an anecdote. It's just not a story as such. But I think it's just down to experience.
I disagree with, sorry, I don't disagree, but I know it's been mentioned, that somebody on the panel mentioned it, about writing being fun. And I don't necessarily agree with that. The writing's work, and sometimes it can be really hard. A lot of the time it isn't fun, and I don't know why you do it sometimes, but because you feel compelled to do it. So I would never quit something because it's not fun. It can be fun, and it's great when it is, but a lot of the time it's not. And I don't know why, and I'm sure a lot of other people in the room feel the same, why I do write. It's probably because I feel compelled to do it. But for me, and as you know, when I'm not writing, I'm a journalist, and I see writing as work, and it can be fun, but often it isn't. So never quit something that it's not fun. Never, you know, you can always come back to that piece of work as well. So that's what I would say that.
I'd agree with that. I think that I really enjoy the act of having written.
Yeah.
It's like running marathons.
Yeah.
Look up type 1 and type 2 fun.
Yeah.
Right. I find that writing's a little bit like going to the gym for me, so I sort of have to turn my brain off in order to sit down and force myself to begin. I really enjoy having just written, but I mean, I have a writing coach because I need somebody weekly to be like, what have you done this week? And I need someone to give me that accountability, because it's not always fun, and sometimes it is really hard. I try and make the first draft as fun as possible, and I really let myself indulge in it. I find the editing bit is where I make that story shorter, fit in with the word count, try and make it fit whatever they're looking for, and sometimes that bit really isn't fun. But
I was talking to Tim Levin last night, horror author Tim Levin, and he's recently done an Ironman, and that was exactly his answer. I said, did you enjoy it? He's like, well, I enjoyed having done it, not during the process. So yeah, sometimes it feels like that.
Yeah, so I'm formulating this question and I'm saying it, so hopefully this is quite quickly. I love epic fantasy, I love the immersion. I'm also a parent with 3 small children and I'm exhausted all the time, so I love shorter fiction because I actually have the capacity to engage with it. And I guess my question is, I think that people who are really into like big, real time or whatever, can look at short fiction and say, I don't get the immersion that I want from it because of the constraint of the length. But I wonder if you have any opinions on how the format of short fiction can work in favor of immersion as well, and getting that experience of being immersed in a moment or in a story or in a scene. Like, how can we, in your opinion, use short fiction to do something that long form can't? If that makes sense. Is there a flip side to that, in your opinion?
So I've certainly written stuff that people have looked into and go, oh, there's a novel here, or there's a whole world that you've created behind this, and it's not the case. It's just a short story.
Yeah.
And to some extent, it's like those old Wild West films where you've got the clapboard front and there's nothing behind it. But for the purposes of the film, there's a whole town there. So you can do that, and it's more down to evocation rather than having something there. It's the illusion of something being there. What the other panelists think?
Every word counts. Trim. I mean, I'm stating the obvious again, but you trim. It's trimmed down to the story's core, and I hope by doing that, you're not going to not that you would in a novel anyway, but you're not going to deviate to something that's not absolutely relevant. So you hope when you're writing anything now, you're competing against Netflix, against Amazon, so it has to be put in a short story format. It's focus. Focus should be the thing. Hopefully, it pulls people in. I don't know what other people think.
It's just rephrasing what you said.
Some of the most memorable short stories for me are stories that start with an idea. They build a narrative around that idea. So it's a thought experiment. And we're thinking of Isaac Asimov, or like a lot of sci-fi. Well, there'll be a thought experiment. Or The Fireman that then it became Bradbury, that then became Fahrenheit 451. So how do you, I think short stories are a really powerful way of taking a social statement or an idea and using a narrative to put it forward. I think you're talking about a truth that you're not really sure what the truth is, you kind of let a story lie. How do you choose? You've got this idea, or a statement you want to make, a truth you kind of want to at least put forward, even if it doesn't have an answer. Can you use that as a starting point for a story? How do you decide, like, whose perspective is it best told from? And how are you going to then build a story or a narrative around that? I don't know if you've ever experimented with that in your own writing.
Start with character. So I start with character, and then as I flesh out that character, I find that truth that's supposed to be there, and hopefully I try to. I'm not saying I do this, but I try and have some sort of poetry in that truth, whatever that might be. But that only comes from what happens to that character and how those characters interact. So I don't know when I start, and that's why sometimes it can be difficult to know what you, unless you've got the idea. Sometimes you do get the idea and you know, then you work towards that, and that truth's threaded through automatically. But sometimes you have to work quite hard to find that. That would be my answer. It's instinctive. It's difficult to say really. Anyone else might have a better answer than me.
I think in terms of working out whose point of view that should be from and all that stuff, sometimes it is just about experimentation, and you might write something from somebody's point of view and then sleep on it and realise that actually it's going to be much better from somebody else's point of view, and maybe a tertiary character was the main character after all, and you have to rewrite. So I would say that finding out that stuff sometimes comes in the edit and sometimes comes in the rewrite, and don't be afraid to do that. It doesn't mean that the work you originally did is scrapped. It means that you were on a journey.
Yeah, going back to something that you said earlier, you may have this idea, but you need to find the conflict and the jeopardy, and the person that you want to write about is the person who has the most at stake in that conflict.
On the other hand, you could be the observer, watching the train crash.
Yeah, you can go for the
reading as witness.
Great. You had a question?
Yeah, so when I'm submitting short stories, I've got like a bit of a rule of 5. Like once I submit to like 5 places, 5 rejections, I generally kind of go, right, I'm going to move on to the next thing, write something else. Would you say that's kind of a good place to draw a line in the sand, or
No,
just keep submitting? Or?
Absolutely not. And also, just to pick you up on one thing there, carry on writing whilst you're submitting.
Yeah.
So don't stop and go, oh, I'm going to submit this story, and then it fails, and you go, oh, I'm going to write something else. Carry on writing as you're submitting. Ian Waits, who's the guest of honour, said on a panel a couple of years ago, of a short story of his that was then in for a prize, it got rejected 15 times. So it is, sometimes you'll bounce off a submission because they've already got something that's similar. Sometimes it's just the wrong editor or the wrong time. So it might not be that there's anything wrong with the story. But if you do get it rejected like 10 times, then maybe look and see and have a think as to whether or not there's something wrong. Not everybody will give you feedback, but we do it at Horizons. I'll always tell people why I'm rejecting the story.
I can think of like 10 places that I would love to get rejected from, for most things. So 5 is insanely few markets to try. I think.
And
Yes.
never throw anything away.
Moving on from that last question, if you submit a story, it gets rejected, do you revise the story? Do you go back to it? Or do you say, no, I've finished writing that story, I'm happy with it, I'm going to submit it as many times as I want to? Yeah. So do you finish a story and leave it, or do you revise once you've had rejection?
I'll open that up to the panel. I've got an idea.
I think it depends on the rejection. So if you've had feedback from that person and they're somebody you respect and you really enjoy the work they've put out there and what they've said makes sense to you, then it's time to revise it. If you're really happy with the story, they haven't offered any feedback to you, I would think about whether or not you actually want to change anything in that story, because after all it is your story. And if you're not sure, I'd give it to one of your writer-reader friends and say, what do you think? Can you test this out for me?
Or go for an editor who employ an editor, a professional editor, to look at your work and tell you where you're going wrong. And sometimes that's quite hard to hear, but that's what you need to become a better writer. And that's what to find someone with that reputation, because you can as well, when you submit stories, get feedback. And it's all right getting feedback, but that feedback's got to be good feedback, and not all the feedback the person give. I'm not saying not to trust the feedback that people give you, but where you submit it, somebody who might have an opinion, but that's not necessarily 100% correct. So you need to find a good person who is somebody an editor who knows what they are doing, and you know everything. Once you find an editor like that, you take it as pretty much gospel within the use your own imaginings too. But yeah, just find a good editor but sometimes you can get feedback from certain markets and you might want to question some of it.
I mean, any feedback you get only necessarily means anything from the person who's giving you that feedback.
It's just one opinion.
Yeah.
It might be an informed opinion, and it's just one opinion.
Yeah, and maybe, like you say, you'll agree with it, and that's when you should revise, and only then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, the alternative to looking for a professional editor is some the kind of industry events. Chimera do workshops, and I ran a workshop earlier this year on short story submissions, and I got yeah, we're out of time. But I got people to send me their stories so I could do targeted feedback. I'm just going to finish with what is it that you'd like to promote? What would you like people to buy of yours or of somebody else's, not yours? And then we can finish.
Starting here or there?
Take a pile of books.
I got my pile of books here, so
okay.
This is my collection. I'm in the dealer room in there if anyone wants a copy. I'm selling them at £5, but this is published by Sinister Smile Press, so it's an American publisher. It includes a foreword by Ramsey Campbell, and I've got a blurb on the back from Mark Morris too. So 11 short stories, Lovecraftian horror, Clive Barker-esque horror. This is not me saying, it's other people. Yeah, just quite a wide range of, and I'm getting some good reviews too. So if you fancy it, then please consider.
I'm promoting The Finery. This is my debut novel. It is a fantastical dystopian romp following a 100-year-old woman taking down a totalitarian government with a wolf sidekick. It was featured in The Guardian's Best of Fantasy and Sci-Fi roundup last month, and I have some limited copies today, but I will be selling them, so if you fancy reading about a 100-year-old woman who is a badass.
Check out podcasting.org for short fantasy fiction in audio and text.
Tina Rath, a collection called Talking to Strangers, and another one called The Adventures of Mr. Porkington, which I can recommend because everyone likes Mr. Porkington. It is sort of horror, but muted horror. My most recent Phantasmagoriana Women in Horror, that stars the cats Gabriel and Ernest, and Supernatural Tales with a recent story. Oh my god, what's it called? Well, it's in there anyway. When you get to my age, it all goes into a Anyway, I'm on the web.
Send me your short stories to BFS Horizons. We do pay. So thank you very much to my panelists.